Mr. President, thank you. Mr. President, there's a lot of talk today of an embargo, and indeed there is one. It's staring us all in the face. It's the embargo the Cuban regime mercilessly imposes on its own people decade after decade after decade. As we meet again, yet again, today, sadly, Cuba is plunged back into darkness. Another blackout is sweeping the island. Blackouts have been affecting the island for many, many years. Colleagues, this is sadly nothing new. Families are once again wondering whether their food will spoil, whether hospitals will have power, whether they will have enough charge on their phones to call their loved ones. But somehow, conveniently, there always seems to be enough power for the regime, for the Cuban dictatorship. There's enough power right now as we speak for the Castro family's compounds. They have electricity. There's enough power for the regime's offices, including, apparently, enough to type up today's remarks, blaming America once again, year after year, for the crisis they have created. There will be, I promise you, enough power for the Cuban propaganda shop to clip and post and translate their lies they're spreading in this body once again around the world. I stand here today to urge the Cuban regime, change your ways, turn the lights back on for your people. You have heard the cry of your own people. Answer it. Answer that cry. Che Guevara, one of the heroes of the regime, otherwise known as the butcher of La Cabón, who, oh, by the way, rounded up gay people and sent them to labor camps. He used to say that Cuba's revolutionaries were, quote, guided by love for their people. Where is that love? I don't see that love. 5 years ago, this month, 5 years ago, on July 11th, 2021, thousands of Cubans filled the streets and demanded freedom. You can pound away, my friend. This is not Havana. This is the United States of America. This is the United Nations. And we will speak, we will be heard, and we will not be silenced like your own people. So pound away.
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker. This is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Before giving the floor, may I remind the distinguished representative of Cuba that in pursuant to Rule 71, a representative raising to a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I call for you to call to decorum the permanent representative of the United States. This is the United Nations General Assembly. You are a liar, Mr. Waltz.
Your remarks will be reflected in the record of this meeting. I also appeal to members to confirm with the practice of the United Nations whereby debates are conducted in a respectful manner. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States of America to continue.
Mr. President, here's what the regime and their very rude and inappropriate representatives do not want you to hear. That 5 years ago, this month, this anniversary is coming up, thousands of their people filled the streets of Cuba and demanded their freedom. They were hungry, they were tired, they are living through years of blackouts. They are sick of a regime that sits on billions while its people starve. For 67 years, the Cuban regime has enriched itself, its ruling elites, while abusing its people, strangling private enterprise, criminalizing dissent, and clinging to failed communist economics. Colleagues, communism has never worked, it doesn't work, and it will not work. And when the Cuban people demanded something better, something different, to have a voice, the regime could choose to listen, but it did not. Instead, it chose to imprison 800 of its own people. And I want to take a moment today to read a few of their names. You should hear their names. You should see their faces. Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. You know what his crime was? He's in maximum security prison. His crime, and this is according to the regime, is, quote, artistic expression. His crime is being an artist, Mr. President. Fernando Almendares Rivera. His crime, he's a musician, and he writes songs the regime doesn't like, calling for freedom. Michael Castillo Perez, another musician in maximum security prison. What did he do? He also wrote rap songs the regime doesn't like. This young man, this amazing young man, Duanes de Bel Leon Tobera, is a young poet. He's a poet. He writes poetry, colleagues, 14 years in a maximum security prison. And these two brothers, Jorge Martin, Nadir Martin Perdomo, the UN, you all, have condemned their imprisonment and called for their release. See their faces as you make your speeches today. Remember them, because they're in prison for daring for freedom. Colleagues, they're not armed, they're not violent, they carry flowers and write poems and write music. And for that, the regime beats them, detains them, and tries to break them. These are the names the delegation here banging on the table doesn't want you to hear. They don't want this assembly to hear it. They don't like free speech. They don't like dissent. And instead, year after year, they hide behind this myth called a blockade. But let's talk about this so-called blockade. I would ask you if there's an embargo, and I'm looking at some of the delegations here. If there's an embargo, a blockade, whatever name they want to put on it, how did humanitarian aid from Belize, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, the European Union, Mexico, Spain, Russia, Uruguay, and the UN itself reach the country just in the last few months? Many of you have mentioned a massive Russian oil tanker with 750,000 barrels of oil just went to the island. There's a humanitarian aid provision in our law for humanitarian aid. There is no ring of Navy warships, U.S. Navy warships, sitting around this island blocking trade or humanitarian aid going into Cuba. It's fake, it's false, it's a lie. Period. If there's an embargo, why does the United States, I'm a native Floridian, I've seen the ships leaving our ports, give $500 million a year in commodities to Cuba? Why is the U.S. providing more than $100 million in aid? I've heard other countries giving aid today, spread over a decade, a few $1 million, $100 million just this year in aid, also working with the Vatican and the Catholic Church to deliver food and medicine to the needy. Aid that we also provided, additional aid after the most recent hurricane. And I ask you, I go back to the fundamental question. If there's no food and fuel for hospitals, how is there fuel for the Castro private family jet? How does President Diaz-Canel afford, you can look it up online, his Hermes tie? How does he afford his Rolex watch and the Mont Blanc pen that he writes with? How does the Castro family afford their 17 homes, their private island, their splashy trips to Madrid and Moscow and the Costa del Sol?
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker once again. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. But let me just remind the delegation of Cuba and all delegations, in fact, a delegation can exercise the right of reply at the end of the afternoon meeting. So I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba if he has a point of order.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a procedural matter. The delegation which opposed and asked for this debate to not take place has taken the floor twice, and it is doing so now in an offensive way against my country, and I call upon you to call upon the Speaker to observe decorum. Thank you.
Your remarks will be reflected on the record of this meeting. I also appeal to members to conform to the practice of the United Nations whereby debates are conducted in a respectful manner. So please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I just will have to say as an aside that the truth hurts and the truth isn't disrespectful. I'm sorry you don't want to hear it, the delegation from Cuba. But here's the part, colleagues, they're really not going to want to hear. This is an organization called GAISA. This is the Cuban military's secretive conglomerate that runs about half the Cuban economy. It has an $18 billion trust fund. I would hope you would all ask yourselves, particularly those that are contributing, where's all the money going? Where is all of that money, $18 billion under GAISA? If you haven't heard of it, it doesn't give a cent of those earnings to the Cuban people. We should also be talking about Cuba's modern-day slave trade. Yes, the Cuban regime ships doctors and nurses around the world and around the region, but here's the part they don't tell you, and they want to bang the table so that you don't hear. The regime takes their wages. They don't get paid. The regime takes the wages and makes them work for free and threatens their families if they disobey. And they do the same with the mercenaries. My European colleagues, please hear this. Thousands of Cuban men are being forced to fight in Ukraine. And do you know where their wages are going? In the Castro family pockets. They're going to the regime. So I question how you can stand here as you take the position that you've taken on Ukraine and not condemn the Cuban regime for sending mercenaries there. It is no wonder, with what I've laid out today, that nearly 2 million Cubans have risked their lives and fled. And where do they flee? They often go to the United States. We have now 3 million Cuban Americans who are proudly thriving as entrepreneurs, as business owners, as lawyers, as doctors, as members of their communities. Even our own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a Cuban American who has risen through our society to represent the United States on the world stage. In contrast, Cuban Christians have been persecuted, dissidents are sent to labor camps, Afro-Cubans are rounded up, and anyone who speaks out pays the ultimate price. So we have to ask ourselves, why does Cuba continue to call for this debate and come to this microphone? The answer is simple, because blaming the United States is the only economic plan Havana has left. And when they try to whitewash their crimes, again, for the second time in one session at the cost of $28,000 per hour, don't fall for it. Don't lend your voice to this propaganda. There is no American blockade. The only embargo in Cuba is the guillotine the regime keeps over the heads of its people. And when the Cuban regime keeps feeding their people in the world these lies, they would do well to remember Fidel Castro's own words. He said, quote, "Deceiving the people, raising false hopes, always brings the worst consequences. Well, the consequences are being felt by the Cuban people year after year after year. And what are those consequences? They are years of blackouts, a population that hates its government, empty grocery shelves, broken hospitals, and millions of Cubans who have fled the island that they love. I ask you again, we heard the foreign minister of Cuba describe the United States as racist and oppressive. Why are so many people trying to come to this country? Why are so many people fleeing their country? The world should not help the Cuban regime hide its incompetence and its malice and its corruption and its greed. We should help the Cuban people break free, realize the freedoms that the Cuban people have dreamt of for so long. I stand with the Cuban people. President Trump stands with the Cuban people. Secretary Marco Rubio, a proud Cuban American, stands with the Cuban people. We call on the regime to release these political prisoners, to allow real economic freedom, and give the Cuban people the very rights that this body claims to defend. Stand with the Cuban people. Do not stand with the regime that has broken that country. You cannot do both. Now is a time for choosing. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America.